This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound. Irving, Berlin. Every year, the American Jewish Historical Society hosts a conference of American Jewish historians. In 2018, this conference took place at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. Dan and I were both thrilled to attend the event, and while we were there, we took the time to speak with a wide variety of scholars about artifacts in the museum exhibition itself. We looked at these artifacts both of their initial historical context and as a map onto contemporary Jewish issues. We're thrilled to now be releasing these conversations as bonus episodes on Judaism Unbound's feed, and in this conversation we hear from Judah Cohen, the Lou and Sybil Mervis Professor in the Study of Jewish Culture at Indiana University Bloomington. Talk to us about this America's Songwriters section. Talk to us about the era that we're situated in the museum and what was happening musically at the time.
This was a really active time to think about in terms of where Jews were. One of the key population centers at that point was in New York City, where many Jews had then gathered over the course of course, over a century, significantly more than a century, really from the 17th century through till the early 20th century. And what began to happen at the time was this emergence of, in the early 20th century, this emergence of a media world where now you start to see the emergence of recordings starting in the 1890s. Really, commercial recordings come about where sheet music becomes more and increasingly available and increasingly affordable, where radio begins to start emerging as something that could exist as part of any household, because radio technology starts to get less and less expensive as the early part of the 20th century moves forward, and similarly the gramophone, which also starts to become much more of a consumer form. So what begins to happen is you start to see the emergence of what's described as Tin Pan Alley, the emergence of this world in which people create these songs that can then be mass-produced and mass distributed, not to mention can then be seen as something that is more broadly American. Now, Jews living in the United States at the time, living in New York, often contributed to this group. And what often you hear about, and what's sort of controversial in one sense, is to say that their experience, or somehow some kind of a Jewish experience, contributed to the way that they thought about or the way that they composed music, that just because someone like Irving Berlin used a minor mode or used an augmented second interval or something like that, that suddenly brings about this idea of what is Jewish into the music. What's interesting is that this was a time, certainly, when people were trying to understand what Jewish sound was all about. This is something that also emerged right around the same time, from the 1880s into the 1920s. Note, for example, that there was a famous musicologist named Avram Tzvi Edelson, who in 1929 wrote one of the first major books on Jewish music, called Jewish Music in its Historical Development, published by a major publisher, Henry Holt, in 1929. And you start to see a much bigger picture emerging. From one side, you have people who are identified as Jews. They may identify themselves as Jews, but just as important, other people are identifying them as Jews and seeing that they have either something in common with them or that they're describing these people as somehow being foreign to American culture, however you want to look at it. You also, as you can see in several of the titles that are in these cases, My Yiddish Mammy, Cohen owes me $97. If it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews, you see the remnants, or if you will, you see the manifestation of what might be described as the ethnic impersonation period of American theater, where people would take on specific kinds of stereotypical identities, a German or Dutch identity, an Irish identity, a Jewish identity. And then, of course, they also, from years back, included blackface identities as well, and performed them on stage. And the composers of these pieces were of a wide variety of backgrounds, but they were able to start performing these kinds of ethnic identities too. What starts to happen by the time you get into the 1920s and the 1930s is that there is this attempt to tell these stories perhaps in a somewhat different way. Nonetheless, individuals who are identified as Jews, let's say Irving Berlin or George and Ira Gershwin or Benny Goodman, start to become seen as well as kind of heroes of Jewish identity. Now, it didn't matter whether or not these people actually saw themselves as significantly Jewish or were very much involved with the Jewish community at all. In fact, George Gershwin, who had very little sense of his own Jewish identity and who almost never went to synagogue as far as I was aware, and who seemed to have very little knowledge of Jewish liturgical music, has in the past several decades been seen as seeing nonetheless certain kinds of Jewish musical styles that he ended up writing almost unconsciously. This connection between, for example, the blessings for coming to the Torah, or the blessings for doing an aliyah of the Torah, and its connection to the song It Ain't Necessarily So, has become apocryphal. People like to think that this is a Jewish musician who is channeling some kind of a Jewish musical tradition. But in fact, what you're looking at here is more an attempt for Jewish communities trying to hold deeply to their own senses of identity, tradition, and heritage, also trying to incorporate these fantastic and well-regarded musicians into their ranks as a way to reinforce a sense of more broad communal Jewish identity.
I have a personal fascination with Irving Berlin on a number of levels, and I have a few questions that you can answer in whatever order. But one thing that I read or heard somewhere was that Irving Berlin, he learned, I don't know if he was self-taught or if he was just not particularly trained, but he learned to compose mostly in the key of F sharp major because it's the black keys on the piano, and it's just when you sit down at a piano and if you haven't been taught what to do, you might start with the black keys because they're elevated above the white keys. And so I heard that, and I was curious if that's a broader reality of self-taught musicians, Jewish and otherwise, and also just generally if the norm might have been in this era that many of the successful Jewish musicians might have been self-taught, given that it was an era defined often, not always, but often by recent immigration and perhaps not backgrounds where they would have been taught deeply musically. So I'm curious to hear along those lines what was happening in terms of people's training and composition.
The story behind Irving Berlin and his compositions is often that he knew how to write in one key, and that from that one key he would then transpose it up or down. Now, of course, if you know Irving Berlin and you know songwriting, that means that he would have had to learn how to compose in at least two keys. One of them would be in the key of F sharp, but the other one, of course, would need to be in the key of D sharp minor, which, of course, is the minor key associated with F sharp. And what you see here in the piano is this metal plate that appears to show the transposition up or down. Now, what does this mean in terms of what Irving Berlin did? Well, remember at the time that the creation of songs themselves were creations that people were able to recreate, or that needed to be recreated on the piano, for example, that could exist in many people's homes, and so really were, in one sense, consumer-oriented. And in another sense, what you often see is these songs are also created for shows. And a lot of the time, these two kinds of creation could exist in parallel to each other. So you would have Irving Berlin's musicals on Broadway. You would have Irving Berlin's songs distributed through the radio and often reproduced in very interesting ways on the radio through radio orchestras and so on and so forth. Now, did Irving Berlin need to be a trained musician? Not necessarily, although many of the musicians who came and were involved with songwriting and with Tin Pan Alley were themselves trained in a number of different ways. Someone like George Gershwin, for example, was a combination. We like to see him as self-taught, but in fact he worked with several teachers. And so whether it be on a formal level, on an informal level, or in terms of just taking weekly lessons, people would become literate in the piano.
One of the elements of Irving Berlin that I think a lot of people are fascinated by, and it's not just him, but he's well known for, is his foray into Christmas music. Mm-hmm. And so there's always the question, and I mean, I hear it come up when people talk about what is Jewish music, because there's the obvious question of, well, if somebody's a Jewish composer and they write a melody for Christmas? Is that is it Jewish music? Is it something separate? Is it a complicated mess of a combination? What is happening there? So can you talk to us a little bit about maybe Irving Berlin, but maybe more broadly? And this relates to some of what you spoke about in terms of identity mapping and how people were looking at cultural music in the early 20th century. But what's going on with Christmas music and so many Jewish composers? It seems like that's something that's worth unpacking.
Well, on the most basic level, if you write a Christmas song, chances are it's going to be listened to and purchased by quite a larger number of people than if you wrote, let's say, a Hanukkah song. Okay, we're talking about Jews representing a relatively small percentage of the American populace versus Christmas, which really kind of became an American holiday or was really Americanized, even to the point that Jews would sometimes take on particular kinds of Christmas traditions or what were seen as Christmas traditions, things like the Hanukkah bush during the mid-20th century, or other kinds of simply even taking off of work in the mid-20th century. So what you see in this particular case is an attempt to try and touch on the pulse of American culture in doing this, to try and find and create songs that themselves conformed to a popular style, in this particular case, often the 32-bar song, and at the same time would be able to appeal to a broad number of people. The only way to be able to survive in the sheet music industry or in the Tin Pan Alley industry would be to sell a lot of copies. Otherwise, you're going to struggle. And when you see Christmas as being a holiday that in some ways became ascendant during the 20th century as a kind of a cultural holiday in the United States, well, then, of course, there were opportunities to really start to think about how that might fit. At the same time, if you go back a little bit, you can also see that many of the songs that we today see as kind of universally applicable to American culture were often created for very specific purposes. So one of the places where you see White Christmas, one of the places where you see Easter Parade, and others would be within the context of film. Film industry was another important area when you look at it. And in fact, where did this become popular? Well, one of the ways that White Christmas became popular was through the film Holiday Inn, in which it became one of the key songs at a key emotional moment that represented just one holiday over the course of a year and included just one performance of many performances of holidays, some of which actually were rampantly racist. So what ends up happening in this case is that one song, which was written for a very specific moment and for a specific artistic purpose, then eventually found an audience that would give it a much bigger or a much more significant place in American culture.
We hope you've enjoyed listening into this bonus episode of Judaism Unbound, and we also encourage you to check out all of our other historical bonus conversations by heading to Apple Podcast or Stitcher or Overcast or anywhere else where podcasts are featured. As always, we encourage you to be in touch with us, and you can always hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com with any questions, follow-ups, concerns, comments, whatever you've got. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.